I'm still very much enjoying this new carpet, this fresh new look for the church. 75 years, 40 years of this building looking the way it is, at least 40. So some of the sections that are newer are at least 40 years old. The carpet was probably about 50 years old. So there's this Pastor Larry from Journey Baptist. And he actually came here when he was young. He got baptized here. And so he asked me, hey, do they still have that red carpet? I was like, yes, they do. And it's crazy that it's been so amazing. With that being said, the sign off right here. And I wanted to keep it. Like we were about to throw it away, and I grabbed it and I kept it. And it says, maximum number of persons permitted this room is 400. What Pastor Dave and I, when we first talked and when we said it, we wanted to make sure that this was a problem, that we were going to encounter a problem, which was we wanted more than 463 people. Like one day makes sense, and so we might have a lot of things that we might say, and one of the main points that I want to drive today for that is these people who we're reading about in Corinthians, they were persecuted. And they weren't just bullied, here at school, you bring your Bible, you get a little like, oh my gosh, look at this nerd, and that's about it. I'm persecuted. That's not it. That's not persecution, I'll tell you that much right now. That's maybe bullying, and that's it. But they were persecuted. They could lose their job. They could lose their livelihood. As a matter of fact, this was written around 45 to 60 A.D. I mean, yes. And so now, 10 years later, they were going to lose the temple. It was going to be leveled. Israel's walls were going to be destroyed. Everything was going to happen. It was going to be terrible. It was a terrible time. And yet, the church was still growing. People were still adding on to the church, and it wasn't just like to the physical one building church. It was like they would have different times where they would meet at different houses, and houses were getting full, but you couldn't have too many people because then you would have a problem of man, hey, look, there's all types of people getting together here. Maybe we should separate so that we don't cause attention. That was a problem that they had, kind of like how we have here a maximum. They had a maximum too, but they were filling their houses, they were filling their things. And one of the things that we use is most of the time is, I don't know how to spread the gospel. I don't know the Bible enough, I know some stories, but I don't know how to say like, hey, we should spread the gospel. I don't know, I don't know the Roman road. I didn't go to Awana, I didn't get the vest, bro. I don't know, man. And so one of my favorite times and one of the verses that I use is, you guys were there. I was outside. I was looking at my friend. My friend Ben was outside, and it was really cold. He's addicted to heroin. And it was sad for me because at one point, me and Ben, we were serving at church. And he would play in the worship sometimes. And we would go to he would play in their worship teams. And we would kind of train and help and do things, right? And he was always super talented. So I told him, hey, what happened? Where did you go? And so this story just came up, and I said, hey, I don't know how to spread the gospel, right? If we're inviting people to church, sometimes we don't know how to spread the gospel, but we do know some. And the story that came to mind was dude, hey, listen, in the Bible, there's a story about the prodigal son who was with the father, who was in his house and didn't really care to be there, and just ended up in the worst place possible. I think you're in the worst place possible, bro. I think you are that prodigal son, and he knew it. He knew that story. He had heard it before. And he looked at me, and most of the time he just looks at me with sarcasm and, just doesn't care. And in his eyes, I knew that something had just sparked, and I said, listen, go back home. Go back to your father. He has his open arms. And man, you could tell there was something touched his heart, but it was because of that story that he ended up wanting to go somewhere. Where, it was tough because he turns around and he's just like, I may be the prodigal son, but you're the other son, aren't you? Sometimes we work really hard for church and we feel like we're not really like getting the attention we want. And that's exactly how I felt at that time. And it was like, man, that story it hit us both. I was spreading the gospel. He was kind of just telling me back, and I was like, man, like we really got to go to Christ. We got to go to the Father. And it was awesome. It was this great experience. He ended up going to his mom's house. He's still lost, and we still pray for him. But I know that the seed was replanted, if you will. The seed was there, and it was good. It's in God's hands now. And my part is that, right? And my part is to go out and spread the gospel. I know I just told you numbers, but what we really want, I don't really care too much about. What I really care about is for us to go and spread the gospel, right? And we don't have to have this awesome system where we just guide them through this little booklet. Hey, man, sign the back of it. You're Christian now. It's going out and telling people about the hope that there is in Jesus Christ, that the Father is waiting for them, that there is something there. And I think that sometimes we feel like, oh, man, it's my coworkers. They're going to think I'm weird, or I don't know, man, they're going to call HR on me or something. Risk it. I encourage you to risk it and see what the Lord has for you, right? It's easy for me because I work at all Christian jobs. So it's, hey, well, your HR probably tells you you're not spreading the gospel, so I understand that those are things, but try, to go out throughout history. God has kept his people. God has covered his people. And I think that it's time for us to really step up in that and to go and be bold, right? I think this is time. We've been seeing it in Revelation as our study goes on. We see that, hey, time is a-ticking. And I think that we should be really reaching out to others, right? So just, let that be an encouragement to you. Maximum 463, and see what the Lord can do. Spread the gospel to people. Reach out to them. Call them. Take them out to coffee. Have some time with them. Don't be afraid to just, go out and do things. There's still so many people that we could bring to him. Amen. All right, here we go. So let's go back to our series, which is called New Reform. And the Reformation was for that. The Reformation is so that we don't have to, go to the priest for salvation. We don't have to pay for our salvation. We don't have to do indulgences. We don't have to, get X, Y, Z before we get baptized to get to the place, to do all these things. We're here to reform these things. And today we are talking a little bit about what we've been talking about. The context is here. The context that we've seen is that marriage is awesome. Marriage is the place where we see the invisible God. The relationship between a husband and a wife is the relationship that Jesus has with the church, and so we can actually exemplify what it is like. Young men, this is what we want to do, is we treat our wives like Jesus treats the church, which means he gave everything. And young women, we treat our husband like the church should treat Jesus. Once the church loses respect for Jesus, then it's no longer a church, it's a social club of some sort. Right? It's a book. It's like the book club without the book. That didn't read the book. That's basically it. And so we want to make sure that we have that relationship. And if that relationship is working, that's good. If we put and we prioritize Christ, then we will be a successful marriage. And as I was telling the earlier service, familiar is basically focused on the family. If you want to have a good family, if you want to have a good future, if you want to have good kids, focus on Christ. Then, primarily, secondarily, focus on your husband and your wife, and then the rest of it will come behind that. Okay? So we'll see a little bit about that. Now, some of us might be thinking, okay, well, Roger, I would love to do all these things, but I've messed up a little bit. I don't know, man. The timing is off. Roger, listen, I would have loved to have a perfect marriage, but guess what? It didn't work out. I'm sorry. Right? Hey, I would have liked to have been a virgin and only have been with one person, but listen, I did not do that. So what now? What do I change? You know, I wish I could have just been perfect, and I wasn't. And so this is kind of where we are now, like, right? So for all the rules that we see that Paul has, right? So he always gives rules, but then there's always the heart behind the rules. He explains why we have those rules. And I love that about Paul, is that like he gives the really specific rule, you know, and he says, my command is a husband should not leave his wife, and a wife should not leave his husband. That's the Lord. And my recommendation is that there's only really a few places in which you can leave your husband and wife, but it's not boredom, right? It's not just, oh, I got to get the new model. She's kind of, you know, like getting a little old. I got to upgrade to the next one. You know, it's not, those are not it. And so these are the rules. But then we have the heart behind the rules. Why? And what we should, because there's very specific scenarios, and we don't live in Greco-Roman times, first century, where we're being persecuted. And so that's why we need to have a little bit more of this. So if you guys have your Bibles, let's open them up. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. And in chapter 7, verse 17, we see that there's kind of like a shift here, and it goes back to like the things that we all have seen, have known, and what the Galatians have seen before, right? We read in Galatians. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17 says this: only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is keeping of the commandments of God. Each man must remain in the condition, oh my goodness, the lag, bro. Each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that. For who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. Closer, right? And we'll go verse by verse. And you know, we are a church that goes book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. It's something that we want to do because we want to read it in context, right? This could have been read out of context, and I love that we have already seen what the context is. It's, you know, we've been talking about marriage, we've been talking about relationships, we've been talking about Q&A, right? So they had like this questions and answers where it was like they asked Paul, hey, what do you think about this? And what do you think about? So he's kind of taking this section to go over each one of the questions that they have. So this is a particular scenario to a particular church. Nonetheless, you know, when your parents are correcting your brother, you better kind of listen, right? If they're telling him and yelling at him, hey, you better pick up all your toys, you better start going over there and, you know. If you're wise, you will listen to somebody else's directions. You will listen to somebody else's and learn from that before you have to go through it, right? So here we are. Let's go over that first. First, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each in this matter, let him walk, and so direct in all the churches. I love this because what is really happening here is that the churches, that word churches is the ecclesia, okay? Which means what? The ones who've been called out. So look at what he's saying. Only as the Lord assigned to each one, as God has called each, in the manner let him walk, so I direct in all the ones who have been called out. That's awesome. And it's just a way to say, you've done things. Maybe you have a way and or shape in which you've walked. in which you were. Now you've been called out. You are no longer this. You are no longer whatever you thought you were. You have no identity in yourself anymore. Now your identity is in Christ. You have been and are now called something else. And I like that, number one, because it really it frees us from excuses, right? And it gives us zero reason to not be a new creation. So now it's like, well, before Christ, I used to be this, and I used to do this, and I used to, and it's classic, and I do love these testimonies, but sometimes there's testimony sharing time, especially during youth group, where you're just like, okay, dude, we get it, right? Have you ever been to like a youth group? I remember there was one time in youth group where we invited somebody, and man, were they going off? They're like, dude, we were doing drugs and more drugs and guns and illegitimate sexual. You're like, oh, hey, okay, bro, we get you were bad, bro. You were bad. But now, I have Christ and I'm doing so much better, because I used to do. Okay, oh, whoa, awesome, dude. You were bad, and your testimony is awesome. That God has called you out of that. But sometimes we have those testimonies and we kind of use our own testimonies in the back to go forward. We use our past to excuse our way in which we walk forward. And so God is saying, and Paul is saying, look, you were married before, you made mistakes, you had divorces, you had all these things. Okay, you were called out for God right at the precise moment in which you were supposed to be called. Not before, not after. You are called now. So now you have to walk from here on forward and not go back, right? Because look at the next verse. It says, was any man called already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to become circumcised. And look at the order in which he says that. Obviously, the first one's a lot harder. That there's no gluing back. There's no, and which was crazy is that, so I did look it up and I was like, okay, why would he even say that? Apparently, there was a procedure that these people were doing. Jews were ashamed of themselves. I'm not sure why, but they were ashamed of having been circumcised. And so they were acting, and so they were going through procedures in order to have like some sort of foreskin. And, I don't know what type of procedures we're going through, but listen, let it be, okay? It's gone. Let's just move forward. And so Paul is telling them, hey, this is where God called you. You were called in this place. Let's not try to be something else. And if you apply this to any of the other laws of the Mosaic laws, it works just as well, right? So, for example, I love the example that we've seen, and I don't know if you have any sort of social media, but on my social media, I've had this recent Kat Von D kind of like has been popping up, and it's because some of you guys are young, you don't know who Kat Von D is, but back in my day, she used to be just a star, right? And so there was this LA Ink, and she would do a show, and she would be one of the tattoo artists, and she was this big like tattoo artist person. And so she has like from head to toe covered in tattoos. And she goes to this mega church, and I guess she didn't really quite like it. So then she goes to this little tiny church. Kind of, if you look at her videos, it kind of looks like this. I thought she was at Trinity for a second. I was like, hey, I missed her, And so she goes to this small church, and everybody embraces her, and they really like want to just pray over her and really guide her. So she gets baptized, and before she gets baptized, and as she's walking with the Lord, she wants to cover up her tattoos. Some of them do have, because part of her is that she goes into satanic symbols and satanic things, right? And so she does have a past with certain satanic worship, right? And so she ended up covering some tattoos, trying to erase some tattoos, and really getting rid of these symbols that have marked her. But she didn't do it in order to get baptized. She just did it because that's where God has called her to, and she was convicted to, right? And I love the fact that everybody just supported her. Now, I have known of some churches who put restrictions on baptism. And they say that you'll be baptized until you erase some of those things that you've done. That is crazy. That is wrong. Wherever God called you, that is where you are. Imagine if she was just like, if they were to tell her, like, your whole neck has to go, your arms have to just get deleted, like how crazy would that be? And I think that that's kind of where the situation where Corinthians is. As extreme as it sounds, it's like they want to uncircumcise themselves. They want to change and mutilate their bodies in order to do something that is not even biblical or called for. God has called you today. He didn't call you yesterday. I guess he's always been there. But he plucked you out in the circumstances in which you are. Therefore, you can no longer go back. Some of the things and some of the mistakes you've made, you will have consequences for, make no mistake. But you will have to move on and go forward and focus on things that are to come. I'm sure when she walked into church, nobody was just like, oh my gosh, look at this nice young lady. She looks so awesome. I'm sure they were like a little sweaty. They're like, I think we're being robbed, but hey, welcome to church, like just in case, I don't know how they were acting, but I know how I've seen how some churches act, and I hope that they really embrace her, but they were probably very nervous around her. That is the consequences of her actions. Those are the consequences, right? She will have people who judge her and who think, what a loser, what a, blah, 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 all these things. They might think negatively about her. Those are the consequences which she has taken upon. But that doesn't mean that she has to correct it in order to come to Christ. She comes to Christ, and then whatever she is convicted of and whatever Christ calls her to do, that's what she does. That's what we do. Right? Oh man, I used to do this. I was convicted. I don't know. I was doing so many bad things, and I was in the world, and I was doing worldly things. And now God has called me, and I have some things that are part of my past. Well, that's part of your past. You can't undo them. Now let's move forward, right? Because look at this next verse. It says, circumcision is nothing, and the uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. That's not a contradiction. When you read that, it's like, well, God literally said, go out and circumcise your children. So that's a commandment of God. So what is he saying then? It's about now completing what you can. And it is all full in Christ. There was somebody who had to complete those commandments. His name is Jesus. Jesus he came not to undo the law, but to fulfill the law. He has fulfilled the law, and now you can live in his fulfillment of the law. And so therefore, try your hardest to keep the law from here on out. You will fail. You will make mistakes. But do not hang on to the past. Do what you're called for today. Do what you have been called for this life, in this new creation that Christ has made you, right? And do your best. What matters is keeping of the commandments of God. Know them. Be there for them. Act as if they are true. And that'll be a blessing for you. But the circumcision itself is not it. The circumcision means really nothing. It's about your heart position, right? I could have no tattoos, dress in a suit, and have just like the best, smell and everything aroma. You're just like the best, your shoes are like extra shiny, best. And I could look really good. But if I don't keep the commandments, then what is that good look for, right? So I could look the part, but it wouldn't matter because I'm not keeping the commandments for the sake of the commandments and for the love of God. I'm keeping them just to look good, right? So like some people are like, oh, I don't have tattoos. Why? Because, oh man, you don't put bumper stickers on Ferraris, bro. Okay, well then that means that you're not just obeying God, you just don't like how tattoos look, right? Well, I don't sleep around, man. I don't like girlfriends, all this stuff. Like you're just ugly. That doesn't mean, like don't do it because you can't or because you don't like to, or I don't party, I don't drink. Like, okay. But is it because you love God? Or is it because you just don't like to do that stuff? Is it not attractive to you? Or is it because you actually do it as an observance of what God has commanded? Right? Some of us, we don't sin or we don't do things simply because we're lazy. Right? I'm just going to stay home and do nothing. I always want to stay home, read a book, maybe, play some Fortnite, OG, I'm just going to do all these, and look, I don't party, I don't cuss, I don't do all these things, and I'm just a nice guy. Well, that's not because you love God, that's just because you don't like to go out. That's it. Do you see what Paul is saying here? It's not the circumcision, it's not the uncircumcision. It's about the heart that which you do things with. It is why and your motivation as to why you do these. So, each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. I've seen this before, the condition in which he was called. He's talking and referring to what he had said earlier in the verses. He says, if you were called while you were single, if you were called while you were married. And so he says each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. He's kind of, referencing back to it. And then he goes into the next one, which is, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. If you are able also to become free, rather do that. So I love this because look at what he's saying is that there is no definition of what you should and or should not be. God is going to define you, not you, not your friends, not the people around you, not your boss, nobody. Tell you how to live your life, and only you should only listen to him. So you were called as a slave, right? So in these days, I think that in American history, we kind of just have this like stigma, we almost flinch when we hear that, that slave, oh man, because of the treatment of and the history in this country with slavery. No, it wasn't always like that. It wasn't in every single case like that. I think that slavery is not condoned in the Bible. It was just the term that was used. So the slaves were usually somebody who was treated, so they would have a contract and they would work for a certain pay, and then that person would either end up being free or end up working a little bit more. That's called a job now, If you work for somebody and then they pay you, that's just a job. And so nowadays, that's what we call it. Some of you guys are like, I don't know, man, I'm pretty much a slave, right? I'm working like 10 hours, 16 hours a day, unpaid, no lunch, right? Yeah, that's crazy. So, yeah, some of us are still being, no, I'm just kidding. But what he's saying here is that if you were a slave, which was usually contracted to somebody, and you're gaining from something, then don't worry about it. That's okay. You don't have to look for something else. You don't have to really change your careers. And I think that into the world, that doesn't quite fit as well because our contracts are not necessarily in like blood. We the day, tomorrow, I have a contract at my work. So if I were to leave, it would be bad for me and I would have to do some, it would just be bad. And so I have a year-long contract. But if tomorrow something happened, I could really leave it. And that's it. So God is calling us to be and to act as free men. And make your decisions yourself, right? You're young. And most of the time when you're right about this age, what shifts do you get at work? The worst ones. The ones that nobody wants, right? And so you go to work and I'm scheduled for Sunday, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., because nobody else wants to do those, right? And so oh, stick the new guy with them because you just got your bachelor's or your master's or whatever, and you're getting that like nice, just like just the worst scheduling possible, right? Friday nights, Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings, and like Monday from like 12 to 12, you know? And it's just like the worst scheduling. So guess what? I think that one of the things that he's calling for here is, look, if you're a slave, if you're a worker, if you're a job person, if you're somebody that works in a place where you can't really do too much about, don't worry about it. Do not worry about those things. Don't think, oh man, I could be doing more. I could be doing. Worry about what is important, which is to serve Christ in the place in which you are. You don't have to change your career to serve Christ. You can serve Christ in your career as you are right now. Don't worry about it. God has a plan. Of course, it says right here, of course you should look for your freedom. You know, I encourage you to look for your freedom. I encourage you guys to change your hours. I encourage you guys to maybe look for a job that has a better work, better pay, better times. That is to be unsaid. I think that's a good idea. Yet, where you are, that's where you can serve. Right? So your mistakes, your relationships, the tattoos, the lack ofs, whatever it is that you're doing, it's perfectly fine because God called you where you are, not where you will be or where you have been. God called you now today to serve him. And I like that, Don't worry about, because sometimes it's like, I'm going to serve situation ready here at work. I got to fix my hours, or I got to fix my relationship with my wife, or I got to, I don't know. I'm just trying to get this ring up by spring. I don't know, then I'll start serving God. And that's not it. Serve God today in the capacity in which you can. The Corinthian church was still, they're not the most persecuted, but they were heavily persecuted, as all Christians were at this time. And they found the time to serve Christ, to go out and spread the gospel. Look at this. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. There's I love these almost contradictions that he's saying. He's really making you think. He's really saying, okay, if I'm a freed man, but but I'm still a slave, it really makes these things really, he wants your brain to really start clicking. There is no excuse. There is no reasoning as to why you should not be serving Christ. Oh, well, it's because I'm a slave. Serve Christ while you're a slave. Well, I'm a freed man. I could do whatever you want. No, you're not. You're Christ. Either way you see it, you have to dedicate your time to Christ. And it's not tomorrow when I graduate from college in 4 years. It's not, when I get married and I finally settle down. It's not after 2, 3 years old, 4 years old. It's not, it's not tomorrow. It really has to be today, because the time is not guaranteed. And he really solidifies this with this. You were bought with a price, not become slaves to men. A reminder of what had to happen in order for us to have freedom, in order for us to be able to come to Christ. There had to be a price that was paid. With a price. He doesn't even mention it, because we all know. Because we all have to come to that determination. We have to come to the conclusion that, yes, the price that was paid was Jesus had to die in order for me to live. Jesus is freedom in order for me to have freedom. Jesus had to give his life, his blood, his purity, all the things that he had to give up on that cross, for me to be able to have and borrow from him, and to be justified by him, and to be sanctified by him. That's what it took. And sometimes we just need a reminder. We just need that reminder, like, oh my goodness, yes, I could be doing these things. I don't have to wait till I'm 22, 24, 28. I don't have to wait for those times. I could do it today. It's just a little harder, maybe, right? It might be a little harder when you have a 12-hour shift and you have to get off and meet up with friends to have some sort of conversation about the gospel. Yes, it is a little harder, but it's definitely worth it. Why? Because you were bought with a price, and that price was Christ's blood, so that you can go take that gospel to them. It's just so we need that reminder sometimes. We need that, like, yes, like push a little bit further. If I could just push a little bit further than I am, if I could just stay concise. Sometimes we don't even have to push really hard, right? Sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to wake up at 8 a.m. instead of 12 p.m., because I'm going to meet up with somebody. It's the sacrifice that I make. Like sometimes it's not that hard to push. It's just sometimes we might need a little reminder of, man, Christ did it all for us. And we can sometimes have to wake up before 2 p.m. in the afternoon, right, to get stuff done. Jordan Peterson he said, I no longer have any people who come to my talks. And the guy who was interviewing him was like, how did you do it? I started doing them at 8 a.m. Apparently, it's too early to protest, And that's crazy. I think that's something that we struggle with. 8 a.m., like physically reacting to like, no way, dude, I can't do that. And so I know that we need a reminder of like, man, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we go out and go, we spend so much time. It is because God has given us that privilege to share his word, right? And it's a privilege to share his word. It is not something that he is forced to command, but he's not forcing you to do it. He's allowing you to do it. He could have given that command to the rocks, and the rocks would have proclaimed his gospel, but yet he allows you to do it, and he allows you to go and spread his word, right? So it's only right to be doing. So I think that this is where that grace comes in. Christ has given us his grace. It is only by his grace that we can really do all these things. You've made mistakes. Relationships have gone wrong. You have had sin in your life, and you've had addictions in your life, or you have addictions in your life, and you have so many things that are going on within you. You maybe chose the wrong career, or the career that wasn't going to help you spread the gospel, right? You're in an office all day by yourself, and then you leave and you go home, the lights turn off, right? There's so many things that maybe you have and you could have done differently, yet this is where God has called you. This is where God wanted you and knew you were going to be. And he wanted you to do things for him, and he has commanded you to do things for him because you are the servant, the Christ, the slave to the Christ. No better place to be. He bought you with the most precious price of them all. He gave his life so that we could be here, right? His grace is sufficient for all of us. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for giving us everything that we have, Lord. There's so many things that we have done wrong, and so many places that we've just, we've really messed it up, Lord. But I pray that we will move on and move past those things, and that you will be able to remind us, Lord, that this is a privilege to serve you, that we were bought with a price, Lord. There's no other place in history where a slave was bought by the price, by the life of the owner. And yet here we are, Lord, serving the God of the universe. So I pray that you will remind us of this, that we will be strong, that we will be bold, that we will share the gospel. We might not know all the verses. We might not have an idea of how to lead others to Christ. Yet you have given us stories. You have given us a time. You have given us a place to where we reach those people, Lord. So I pray that you will encourage us, make us brave in order to go